My name is Natalie Fritz, and I am the Archivist and Director of Outreach for the Clark County Historical Society. And for the past few years, we have been doing virtual programs to highlight things from our collection, things from the archives. And for a while, we were doing them twice a month. And now we're trying to do something at least once a month and bring in special guests like we have tonight, so that it's less work on me to find topics. And we always are happy to hear from people in the community as to what kinds of topics they'd like to see more about. But we like to highlight things that we have with the programs like this. We always record them. They are available afterwards on Facebook and on YouTube so that people can go back and look at them. And we found that it helps people with research. We come up and, you know, those various topics that people are looking at. So I'm hoping that with tonight's, we can help people that are looking for more information on quilts and the history of quilts, because I know our guest tonight, Virginia, is going to have a wealth of knowledge for us. So Virginia Weygandt is our former Director of Collections. She retired at the end of 2020. And she took some well-deserved time away from us, but we knew she would be back eventually. She's been volunteering with us since 2022, and getting back in with the collections that she loves and continuing some of the big inventory and re-inventory projects that we've been doing in collections. She's our expert on just about everything we have in the collections, especially textiles and quilts. She was always the go-to person to ask questions about that. So we had talked about doing this as a podcast or a sit-down thing with Virginia to talk about our quilts, but then we came upon this idea to go ahead and do a virtual program. So Virginia had a lot of memory about ones that she knew that we had, and we went through and had pulled up some quilts. So I'll let her tell you more about herself and introduce what she's going to talk to tonight. I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Natalie, so much. I've always been fascinated by objects. And so to me, it was logical to think, well, you know, what could I do with my interest in objects? Then I found out that there were people who actually are called material culturalists. And what that means is they are people who study objects to understand history better. Because often the changes you see in an object give us some kind of an idea of what was happening within societies. So I thought, well, that's a good idea. So when I went to grad school, I started doing more and more study about objects and about history. This idea of looking at objects to understand history is really important for civilizations, whether they're literate or especially if they're people that are illiterate. Even here in the United States, we understand that there are whole groups of people that left few or no records. That would include immigrants. Women often didn't leave extensive records. Someone who was enslaved or our indigenous peoples left no kinds of records that historians could use to understand their history, but the objects, so many of them have remained, and it makes a good chance to understand what people were like, what their aspirations, their hopes, what their skills were like, how their skills changed over time. So what we're going to do tonight is look at some of the beautiful quilts that I had an opportunity to handle when I was in the Historical Society. I also did what was called registrar work, which means I got the first peek at the items that came through, whether they were archives or objects. So I had a wonderful opportunity to handle the many objects in the Historical Society. So let us begin looking at quilts and quilts and quilting. Quilting is a much older art form than you might understand or might have ever even thought about. The earliest depiction that we have of a quilt is actually on an ivory figurine that dates from the first Egyptian dynasty. What it shows is a pharaoh, maybe a high official, wearing a coat that has the obvious, or not so obvious, it's kind of hard to see, squares on his coat. It's in the British Museum. I actually had a chance to look at it the other day online. And if you look, you can see the vertical lines. The horizontal lines are a little difficult, but that's the first one that we know of. It dates, it's 5,500 years old, so it is a very old object. As far as we know, quilted objects, or at least the knowledge that there were quilted objects out there, came to Europe in about the 12th century, at least from other places. And the first place we encountered, the Europeans encountered people who wore a quilted type of clothing were when, as part of the Crusades. So the Muslim invaders and attackers that they saw wore something that was padded and sewn, and they were very interested in what they saw. Now we know that those same Muslim soldiers actually got that idea, their civilizations and their culture got that idea from older civilizations, including the Arabs, the Chinese, and people from India. And India especially had a big impact on American quilting. The oldest quilt in Europe dates from about 1395. And it's this love story about Tristan and Isolde, star-crossed lovers that kind of miss each other in the night. It's a white on white quilt and looks much like this. This quilt is known as the spinning counterpane, named after the family who owned it and donated it to the Historical Society. It's very interesting. It has in the middle what looks like kind of a medallion almost. The medallion quilts were very, very popular in this late 18th and early 19th century. So we have this what looks like a ring in the middle, having a Greek key kind of motif, and right in the middle there are grapes and grapevines. So it is really lovely. Of course, that grapevine and the grapes motif kind of continues through the whole quilt. It's considered a white on white quilt, so it's white stitching on a white background, and it's called a whole cloth quilt, which means that instead of piecing or having strips of something, it's one whole piece of material, so that you get this beautiful effect of one large, almost picture-like object. There, it is quilted in very, very tiny squares, very beautiful close stitching. What you can see here in the slide itself is things look kind of raised. Well, that was deliberate. That's called trapunto. And trapunto means you're sticking little tiny pieces of cotton from the underside of the quilt up into the top, so you've got this lovely raised effect, and it sets off the light and dark in the quilt itself. It has a little fringe, which you can see, but only on 3 sides. Part of it is draped, of course, over the pillow, and you don't need fringes there. All you need are the fringes on the 3 sides. So when we're talking about quilts, we know that they were around everywhere. We have found them in the Americas. We have found them in Europe, Africa, Asia, India. So why don't we have many in the United States? What's going on? And it's a good idea at this point to say, well, what is a quilt traditionally? What does it mean that something is a quilt? The quilt usually has 3 elements. It's kind of like a little sandwich, okay? You have the top, which could be whole, like our spinning counterpane. It could be pieced, or it could be appliqué. But whatever it is, there is a top piece, usually very decorative, because that's what you want people to see. In the middle is something called a bat. Now, there can be commercial bats, and we'll talk about when they came in, or it could be cotton strips that were laid down right from after being carded and gotten rid of a lot of the seeds. Those would go down. It could be wool. It could be an old quilt that that you still wanted to use as extra warmth. That could be put in the middle. I've heard of feathers, straw, and even paper. Now on the bottom, some people call called a lining, but on the bottom, again, you have that idea of it's either a whole piece of cloth or it's strips of cloth, and they can either be plain or they can complement the pattern or the color scheme of the top piece. The trick is all three layers should be sewn together or at least tied together, and that's what constitutes a quilt. So we have to ask, so okay, we understand what a quilt is. What does it mean that there are so few? And I think as we look back in our colonial period, we can understand why there are so few. One of the things is anyone coming to this new world and settling, their needs were very, very few, but very important. They needed food. They needed shelter. They needed safety. They needed, especially if they came as part of like the East Bay Company or the Hudson Bay Company, they would need to start a viable economic crop so that they could pay their backers. So fabric had to go right away to clothe people. That's what was important. In fact, anything from the skin out is what was produced and sewn at home. So, you know, fabric went there rather than into other things, and fabric was very, very expensive. So the priority was clothe the people. As clothes were worn out or someone became too large, just grew up, then things were cut down, they were recycled and given to younger members. By the end of them being worn, they might have gone into a rag bag or they might have gone for something else to make a quilt, but that might not happen for a while. In fact, with many quilters, some things languished in your rag bag for quite a while. The first successful colony, Jamestown in Virginia, there are no written records of whether there were quilts, whether they brought any with them. They may have, they probably did, but the records aren't there. As settlers moved westward and we became more settled as a country, then there were records and especially letters that mentioned what was included in trunks or in the wagon as it went westward. So we do know that the quilts were there. Early pioneers, especially those who were settled and then when we're going westward, were encouraged, in fact, highly recommended that they have 3 to 4 quilts per person in the family in the wagon, ready to go, because they were used for everything. You could pad a wagon, you could swaddle a baby, you could pack your dishes in a barrel all nicely padded so they wouldn't break. And if need be, especially if you were out on the prairie, you could actually use a quilt as your shroud. So it was used in many different ways, and they were very utilitarian. Excuse me. And they were used to the point where there was just nothing left. In the early part of the 19th century, America was still largely agricultural. And, excuse me, home was a domestic factory in which all members contributed, and it didn't matter how young they were. Children as young as 2, both boys and girls at this point, were taught to sew a variety of simple stitches, and they were expected to do a certain stint, whether it was a certain time period or a certain amount of stitching every single day. The most common stitching they did was to do a 4-patch block. So that means it was 4 little squares sewn together. And when they were all done, then you had a lovely little quilt block that you could make a whole quilt out of. 2 of our former presidents, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water. President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Calvin Coolidge both remember and recalled very fondly what was called their fireside teaching, which meant that mom would sit on a chair and a little one would snuggle up close or sit on a lap and both watch mom sew and have an opportunity to sew themselves. If you were 2 years old and could hold a needle, then you were already sewing. Young girls were expected to bring their sewing to school and they were given time to work on it. This particular sampler that you see here was made by Magdalene Wolff in 1833. This is a way that young girls would not only learn new stitching, but they could practice their stitching over and over. You can see how many stitches and that they are repeated often. And it would give them a chance to also show their expertise. I learned a new stitch. I learned how to count this. I made this. I did this. And so even friends and families would ask, how is it going? Show me your quilt or show me your sampler to make sure that young girls were being properly trained. In this kind of household economy, it was very interesting because women had the opportunity to sell their needlework, whether it was plain or fancy, sell their seasonal fruits and vegetables, dressed chickens, and eggs. And even if a portion of that went into the household, the women could keep some for themselves. I remember my grandmother talking about egg money and pin money. And in fact, we still use that parlance. You have a nest egg that you pay into for your retirement. Well, the idea was you are making some money out of what you had in your home, and you could keep it as a woman for yourself. Oh, by the way, the funny looking brown thing, that's actually a little doll bed and has a small quilt on it. Quilting for your doll was a very important thing the girls did. Early education for girls was not just stitching to stitch, but to be learned and to become and be fit for becoming wives and mothers. Girls needed just enough reading and writing and arithmetic to manage a household, and sewing was a fundamental part of this. Now, if you had the good fortune to be the daughter of someone who was moneyed, who was rich, there might have been some other options. So what you see on the screen here is something called the Springfield Female Seminary. The 1855 catalog showed a lovely picture of the school itself. These are the school grounds, and had in the front the principles upon which the school was run and what you could expect your young lady to learn. Especially, excuse me, the young ladies who came out of the Springfield Female Seminary were qualified indeed to handle the big responsibilities resting upon them as Christians, ladies, and mothers. That didn't necessarily mean that in all the learning of their French and drawing and painting and mathematics and literature, that they were going to have any other type of career and one that made money. This time period that we're looking at in the early years of the 19th century, excuse me, I have a little bit of cold, gave us some enduring patterns that people are still using and probably will always continue to be using. And there's a wide selection in the Historical Society itself. This is called an 8-point, or what is known as a Lemoyne star. As you can gather, Lemoyne is a French term, and the pattern itself arrived in the United States in the early 18th or the late 18th, early 19th century. According to tradition, it was attributed to Francois Lemoyne, who was a painter and painted the ceiling of the Chateau de Versailles in France. Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion because he's also been called Jean-Louis Lemoyne, so I'm not quite sure. That would take some more research. But this particular quilt was made by Melinda Jenkins Baker in 1870. And you can see in the center of these kind of pointed or triangular looking squares, there is an 8-point star. You can 8-point star, you can count them. And you can see that they are surrounded by white little squares and then red plain triangles, and that all of it is surrounded by these lovely green triangles that make almost little points. Now, what interests me, there's a lot of things interesting about this quilt, is that first of all, the white is more prominent than the stars. The white hits your eye before the stars hit your eye, which is a very interesting contrast. Usually it's the other way around. There are in the white spaces beautiful swirls, and you can especially see there's a difference just in lighting. So yes, it does look that white, but you can see in the right-hand slide that there are these beautiful swirls, almost waves of stitching that are on the borders. So this is a very fine quilt, very nicely made, good composition. For my taste, it has a little bit too much white, but it is very eye-catching. The 9-patch, this is one of my favorites. The 9-patch is a wonderful, wonderful pattern from this time, and people love it because it's simple to do. It's really easy to sew. They're nice straight lines. You don't have to worry about curves. And it's one of the best ways to use up scraps. And who doesn't? If you quilt, you've got bags and boxes and little containers and big containers of scraps. Its very simplicity belies the fact that it can really be used very intricately. And this beautiful blue and white quilt demonstrates that placements and orientation make all the difference in the world. This is one of those things that is a uniquely American pattern, and it dates from the early part of the 19th century. And it was very, very popular during the Civil War. It's something you could make very quickly, easy assembly. This particular quilt is dated to right around 1900 and was created by Viola Baker Huffman. The little blue squares, which you can kind of see on the right-hand side, have little patterns in them. Most of them are white on the blue, but they're very, very small. The stitching is around each square, and there are nice straight rows of stitches in the body that are less than an inch apart. So nice, tight, very good stitching. The white edging is rolled, or the quilt edging is rolled, and it's just a beautiful little quilt. The most popular combinations in this part of the century were not only blue and white, but red and white and black and white, because they made some of the most stunning quilts. Nope, I think I went too far. Yes, I did, because one of the most important ones, one I really love, is the log cabin quilt. And this one is stunning. The log cabin quilt came from Ireland to America in around the 1800s, the mid 1800s, which is when the Irish started showing up in the Clark County area as they came on the National Road. They were part of those who helped build the National Road. This quilt shows a really strong mastery of design and exceptional fabric artistry. The center of each block is red and is supposed to represent the hearth, which is the heart of the home. and the strips of cotton. There's cotton, chintz, wool, brocade, all these lovely, lovely fabrics which surround this red center represent the logs of the cabin. It is the play of the light strips and the dark strips are to remind you of the sun in the morning and the darkness in the evening. And this play of light and dark became especially meaningful to those women who ended up traveling west, and especially on the Great Plains, where that's really all there was. There might not have been a tree or another building to break the horizon, but there was the sun rising that you could see on the horizon forever, and the same thing at night, the moon in the evening. There, the back, I just didn't have enough room. The back is a gorgeous, gorgeous whole cloth back, which has chintz in red, black, and brown with a little tiny flower pattern. And as you can see, there are two borders. The last one, which I think is gorgeous, is the paisley. Some people have argued, and I guess can still argue, that this is not a quilt, simply because there is no stitching, and there's no stitching that goes through the 3 layers. Now, there are some log cabins that are indeed tied, but not stitched. But I think everyone agrees that with their artistry and their beauty, that log cabin quilts really are, as they say, quilts. The friendship quilt has a long history, and it is definitely an American quilt that came from New England. They were typically given to missionaries, especially, but also to family members who were leaving the area, and especially going further west. Who knows when they would have seen them again. Now, if it was for someone who was leaving the area, then it was very common to keep the quilt a secret until it was all done, so that it would be a surprise for the gathering where everyone was saying goodbye. Friendship quilts, again, like the log cabin quilt, really became treasures because it represented everybody and everything that someone had left behind, and those things that were really precious. Some have even called them a protest, if you will, against the men who dragged them out west. Oh, I don't know. You can decide. Friendship quilts were very much like the autograph albums that were popular at the time. Women wrote, loving sayings like the one that you see on the slide, which reads, "Remember me when this you see, and think of one who thinks of thee." Autograph albums were very popular, even into the middle of the 20th century. I had 2, and I asked my dad to sign it or to, put a little saying into it. And so he wrote, I quote, "To my brown-eyed blonde with the ponytail, you are so sweet you won't go to jail." Not quite what I expected, but the truth, and very much his sense of humor. This friendship quilt that we're going to look at in another slide as well is known as the Brain Mills Friendship Quilt, and it was made, the estimate is sometime between 1848 and 1850. It was discovered by Dorothy Brain Mills as she was cleaning out her aunt's house. It's all cotton. Every square is the same, although there's one on the left-hand side of the slide you can see looks slightly different, and I really don't know why. It was common to have the quilt pieces sent out so that everyone could sign their own name and send them back, so that the whole quilt could be put together. In this, you see the normal convention of what people did with a friendship quilt. The first one is Mrs. Torbett. She wrote, "Memory is here." So the things you need to remember are wrapped up in this quilt. for unmarried young women or for teenagers, then her name was used. So you have Ellen R. Spencer in the middle, and who also gave us very helpfully Springfield, Clark County, Ohio, as her place of residence. The other square on the right is not typical of a friendship quilt. After all, the friendship quilt was art made by women for women. So what are these men doing here? Well, with the research that Dorothy did, she found that they were the ministers of the First Presbyterian Church. And so in true minister of the gospel fashion, they actually put a reference to Numbers 6, the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, chapter 6, verses 24 to 26, which is, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be gracious to thee. The Lord lift up his countenance and give thee peace. The technological changes of the 19th century changed the way women approached quilt construction. In 1851, Isaac Merrick Singer patented the first practical, commercially viable sewing machine. 1858 was the first production run, and there were 3,591 sewing machines that were produced that year. By 1870, the production run was 127,833 sewing machines. So you can see that they became immensely popular. The sewing machine provided new challenges and facilitated all kinds of work of piecing quilts, especially. Sarah Josepha Hale, who actually was the editor of Gotti's Ladies book, said the sewing machine was a blessed release. She estimated and argued that 24 hours of hand stitching could be accomplished in 2 or 3. And a man's shirt only took 57 minutes, when by hand it used to take 6.5 hours. The only problem was that with the sewing machine, women decided they could do more, like what you see on the left-hand side. So why not add a few more ruffles or tucks or gathers or whatever it was to embellish your fabric? And so it might have been a little bit of a mixed blessing. England's monopoly on fabric production, which they had had since the late 18th century, began to ease by the middle of the 19th. In 1836 alone, American textile mills produced 120 million yards of calico. To get their goods where they wanted them to be, American textile producers used the most up-to-date technology that there was, which was the locomotive. In Clark County, you had the Mad River and Lake Erie Railroad and the Little Miami Railroad. And this 1842 advertisement shows you that by then, men at the dry goods and cheap goods store was advertising the material that came in from Philadelphia and Baltimore, and that you could get direct from the East Coast at the best price possible. So you could get silk, linen, cambric, fig de laine, muslin, chintz, jaconet, and calicos in whatever styles and whatever colors that you wanted. So cheap fabric finally was available, and meant that women could now afford to sew fancy clothes and quilts. By the mid to end of the century, there were things like a commercial bat to put in the middle of your quilt, and things like twisted cotton thread. In the 1830s to 1860s, something occurred to change women's standing within society. It was called then the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. It was a conservative reaction to the social changes wrought by increased industrialization and urbanization. Industrialization removed two important things from women's control. One was the production of textiles, and the other was food production. So women lost their sources of independent income and became dependent upon their husband's income. On top of that, they were relegated to just one sphere, which was the home itself. Men did the work out in the noisy, nasty world of commerce. Women were considered much too pure, too morally sensitive, too delicate, and intellectually unfit for the rigors of life out in the world. So women were reduced to just two responsibilities. Number one, keep the house tidy and pleasant and calm, so that when the husband came home, he could relax and forget the rigors of the day. Number two was to raise the children. In that kind of atmosphere, then sewing became quintessentially feminine. And it changed dramatically. So boys weren't involved anymore. It was a feminine responsibility. And doing anything that was patchwork showed that you were the ideal housewife. All these ideas were reinforced in things like Peterson's magazine, Godey's Ladies' Book, and as you see here, the Ladies' Home Companion, whose magazine was also called the Practical Household Journal. We're going to skip ahead a little so that we have enough time for questions. Sewing fostered those important cult virtues, such as patience and selfishness. It helped us women develop proper decorum. It helped us to compose our delicate nerves and were the source and evidence of our true virtue. Someone who did not sew was not feminine. And so, not surprisingly, sewing became the opportunity to pour women's energies into this creativity. And there was this huge outpouring, and some people called it an explosion of the most beautiful quilts between 1850 and 1875. They were the years when we had the highest experimentation and the highest innovation that came to quilting. Both applique and piecing really grew and came to the fore. And of course, let's face it, the high water mark of this whole period was an old pattern that was a brand new craze called the crazy quilt. The crazy quilt is one of the oldest quilt patterns and this is generally what everyone thinks, because you can find them again back in time as far as Egypt, back to Egypt. It's characterized by the use of these really rich, luscious fabrics like velvet, silk, and brocade. Now, granted, they were in use early on, but what really brought the popularity was the 1876 Centennial Exposition held in Philadelphia. That was the first opportunity that Americans had to be introduced to Japanese culture, art, and textiles. So from 1876 to 1920, textile producers finally got the idea, if we offer these pre-selected, pre-packaged kits that have the silk and the velvet and the brocade, then women would almost eat them up because it was a way of creating these beautiful quilts. This crazy quilt, and unfortunately we don't know who did it, has piece blocks. You can see the nice square blocks with a fan motif. The fan, the lower part of the fan is brown velvet. And you can see where the stitching is, and it has a lovely scalloped edge. The scalloping was one of those things that the new sewing machine made so much easier. And this one has both the velvet scallop and interspersed is the silk scallop. And this is where the wonderful embroidery is. Now, making things in squares actually is a whole lot easier than doing a whole quilt design, which we're going to see in just a minute. And even though this may be hard to see, if you look on the left, you will see that you can follow the vertical lines down and the horizontal lines kind of across. There is a very interesting thing, kind of in the lower left, you'll see this very round red, which looks like maybe a bullseye. You can't quite figure it out. That's a piece from a man's coat. So if you're going to use silk, you use every bit of silk that you have. Unfortunately, as you can see on the right-hand side, this quilt does have some damage, but it gives us an opportunity to peek behind the top to see how this quilt was put together. Crazy quilts and log cabin quilts are constructed using the same method. There's always a backing piece that you can see kind of looks like it has little paper clips or swirls. Okay, that's the backing. So you would put your piece of silk face down on the backing, sew an edge, turn it to the right side. So turn that piece to the right side and press it so it was in place and it didn't flop out of place. And then you would build your quilt that way. Every piece is done a piece at a time. If you look again at this right slide, you'll see that you can just about see the little stitching from the triangle to the right. And on top of the triangle, after it was done, was put a piece of braid. The stuff that looks like black threads, that's actually a piece of silk that was fractured. It just gave way, which unfortunately happens often with silk. This, as far as I'm concerned, is the cream of the crop when it comes to the quilts that the Historical Society has. This is indeed a whole crazy quilt that were always described as having no design at all. But it fits. It fits. This is really, I can't say it. I don't even know how to say it. It's just beyond gorgeous. It is absolutely sumptuous. It is. Was made by three Rader sisters, Helen, Nanny, and Georgietta, for their sister Mary Ellen, soon to be Mary Ellen Adams. Some of the fabric, in fact, in this quilt came from her trousseau. It has everything, as you can tell by the two little inserts. It has embroidery. It has embroidery in yarn. It has embroidery in silk. It has embroidery in floss. It has all kinds of little kind of whimsies. You can see in the slide on the left that there are little cherries with their leaves. There's a little person. I'm not sure who the little person is supposed to be, but there is. There's also a juggler, a watering can, a teapot and some delightful things in this quilt. It dates probably from about 1833 and really lives up to its name both as a crazy quilt and having, as I say, no design at all, yet we know that this took an immense amount of planning and detailed construction and ideas of how this could be put together to really highlight the beauty and the, just the love that the sisters had for the sister was getting married. Interesting feature of this particular quilt, which you can't see easily, and I couldn't quite fit it in. There's a silk menu from the Arcade Hotel. That's because one of the other sisters married the proprietor of the Arcade Hotel here in Springfield. So when you have a piece of silk, you use a piece of silk. The idea of sewing for charitable and benevolent purposes probably came with the first early settlers into the New World. Churches, which always valued and appreciated women's fabric skills, were the training ground, if you will, in which women learned to appreciate other women and their skills and their trials and the things they were going through. In addition, this whole cult of domesticity's emphasis upon selflessness and service to others, especially the poor, eventually propelled women out of the home and into the community. As it was said at the time, the home is no longer encompassed by four walls. Most of its most important duties lie now out in the bigger family of the city and the state. Women became involved in two important movements, if you will, in the early 19th century. One was anti-slavery. The other was temperance. At the outbreak of the Civil War, most women joined some kind of soldiers' aid society, which was basically a sewing circle. And they made shirts and whatever they needed or could get a hold of, or the men wanted for them to send. The local branch that was affiliated with the Cincinnati branch of the Sanitary Commission was held at Mary McCord Hunt's house, which was the Kenton Farm out on what is now 68. The Sanitary Commission was a private relief agency created in 1861 to support sick and wounded soldiers of the Union Army. Between 1863 and 1865, it held regular, what were called sanitary fairs to raise money for the cause. Now, the banner you see in the right-hand part of the screen is not a quilt, but it is an extremely important part of Clark County and women's history. We know that at the Great Western Sanitary Fair that was held in Cincinnati in December of 1863, the Clark County booth held, like probably most of the other booths, all kinds of wonderful needlework things. It was cuffs and capes and collars and shirts and trousers and shawls for women and scarves and dressing gowns and even things that we don't think of, like ink wipers. If you're going to wipe your pen, do it on a piece of cloth, not on your sleeve. That's, far better. I mean, the cloth, not the sleeve. In total, Clark County raised $5,580 for the good of the cause, which was more than any other county at that fair. So the banner itself, and you can see that the Historical Society at the Heritage Center is a very important part of Springfield and Clark County's history. The cult of domesticity was at best an ideology, and it was not universally shared by all women at all times. In fact, Frances Willard, who was president of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was founded in 1874, confessed that she hated sewing and would much prefer to be outside running around climbing trees. And she also confessed that it took her 5 years to complete a simple sampler. However, and most importantly, she really did appreciate and greatly respected the union's wives and mothers and sisters who espoused not just the cult, but really understood, as she did, that drinking was a problem and it was a blight and a real stain on society, and it was harmful to the families. And she, like so many others, not just the women, but there were men involved, but not in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And all of them agreed that drinking was causing societal problems that hurt women and children. Now, while she was the more politically astute and politically motivated person, our own Eliza Daniels, also known as Mother Stewart, was far, far, far more practical. And she actually did things that helped, or some would wonder, would they help the cause of temperance? And she was unafraid to confront the problem head on. She went and testified in court. My goodness, how scandalous. But she was very polite and tried to make the case that the woman in question was being harmed by the husband, who was drinking the family money away. She won the case, which was interesting. She also conducted local crusades by going up into the hotels and walking out on the balcony and preaching to the crowds. She would send her prayer bands to disrupt the sales of liquor at local saloons. There were not many men who would cross the paths of a group of kneeling, praying women. Yes. Now, the reason I bring this up is that I have just learned in my research that I think I'm right in saying this is a temperance quilt. It has 1,224 signatures from the White Rose Club. The White Rose is not only a symbol of purity, but is a reminder of the promise in the Women's Christian Temperance Union that we are true to the pledge of temperance. So there is also then on the back, you can kind of see the little insert on the bottom that says made by the White Rose Club. The person who wrote all 1,224 names was Reverend Henrietta G. Moore. When I looked in the 1893 city directory, Moore is listed as treasurer of the WTCU. So between the color white rose and her name, I think this is a temperance quilt. And the fact that it looks like a flag means that this is something that we all want and affects everyone, not just the people who signed the pledge, but they all signed the pledge to espouse temperance. It was given to Memorial Hall in 1932, and it eventually came to the Historical Society. Well, quilters have never stopped quilting, sewing, and innovating. And I know that our quilters here are probably going, yeah, that's me, that's me. Like their foremothers, modern quilters get great satisfaction from creating something that is beautiful and completely unique, as you can see by what we looked at tonight, and that are loved and cherished by whoever is fortunate enough to receive them. But the key difference between those quilters of the 19th century and quilters now is that we get a lot of respect, both for our craft and our art. There are textiles and fabric artists who create highly sought after works of art that can go for very high prices. And on top of that, we have even some cooler technology, including computer enhanced sewing machines and long arm quilting machines that make quilting even easier. As I said, there's still women quilting. Some are even quilting for fundraising or to promote a cause. And this is one of two interesting quilts that we got from the Clark County Veterans Services. They were donated in 1994. We don't know, or else the donor who gave it to the commission asked that they not share the name of who made the quilt. But we know that it was done during Desert Storm and Shield, which began August 2nd, 1990 and ended in 1991. Up in the left-hand corner, you can see the state of Ohio with a star there. And the saying says, as you read the names sewn with love, please say a prayer to God above. The servicemen and women listed are, we also have their branch of service, which is very interesting that whoever did that included it, because I think it helps with the identification. There's a nice gusset at the top, so you can actually hang it. You can put it on a rod and hang it. It's all machine quilted, but it is tied in each of the squares with red and blue floss. So it is a beautiful and very interesting commemorative for a cause kind of quilt. Tonight, you've seen what social ideologies and expectations, local and national events, available or unavailable resources, and changing technology have influenced quilters and quilting itself, which is both an art and a craft. Quilts still delight and inspire whenever you get a chance to see them. They inspire us as quilters and ordinary folk. They continue to inspire historians. And I hope will do so for many, many years to come. Before we get to the point where you can ask some questions, I have one more thing to do, which is to thank heartily the staff of the Historical Society, Casey Eichenzer, who is Senior Curator, Natalie Fritz, who is Archivist and Director of Outreach, Miranda Taylor, who is our it's still mine, Carlton Davidson intern. They dragged up from every corner so many boxes of quilts, and Miranda especially took just frames and frames and frames of photographs for these lovely quilts. And they all put up with my ooh and ah. Gosh, I forgot this. It was a wonderful time, and I appreciate so much that I had a chance to tell you about these quilts, which I think are a real treasure for this Historical Society. I also can't thank enough Roger Chirac, the CEO, and the board. I'm a volunteer. I'm not a staff anymore. And the fact that they let me come in and open boxes and make a presentation tonight is very lovely. And I do appreciate everyone who came. Thank you so much. And I'm ready to take questions. Hi.
All right, yeah, I figure I'll switch to, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yes.
all right, I'll switch to, so we can see each other if people wanna,
Good. Yes.
turn their cameras on. But Virginia, we're so happy to have you and to hear you share about this. And I was thinking, we did take a lot of photos. Maybe we should put up a Flickr album or something where
You
we can
should. Yeah.
share some of the details of the quilts that people can look at closer.
Yeah.
Because there's so much great detail in all of them, and ones that you didn't get to talk about tonight,
Right.
that are just really wonderful. So if you have a question, we could try, you could physically raise your hand if you've got your camera on. You could do the raise hand feature. I see Kathy and Lee Weygandt have their hand up. You guys are welcome to unmute if you'd like to say anything.
Hi.
Well, hey, good to see you.
Good to
Thank
see
you so much for having this. It's a wonderful way to see your skills. I'm wondering, how in the world do you store and display so many delightful things to look at like that, all these quilts?
Well, just because of space, there's more storing than exhibiting, and I'd love to do an exhibit, to curate an exhibit sometime. The storage, ideally, if we had the space, which we don't have in this institution, we just don't, as big as the building is, we don't, would be to roll the quilts. Now, there is some debate whether you should roll something that has 3 layers and is stitched, because you could stretch the stitching and it won't roll very well. Because our space is different, the Historical Society puts them in the biggest possible box that we can, so that we can lay them as flat as possible. The boxes we have, I've always affectionately called snake boxes, because they're taller than I am, and they're long and they're skinny, which I'm not. But it is a problem. Good acid-free boxes from a reputable supplier and good acid-free tissue are the best ways to store a quilt, especially one that has any kind of damage.
Virginia, there's a question in the chat about if we have any idea how many quilts that we have.
I know that I looked at easily 15. There's I know there's more.
I was gonna say,
my brain and my eyes went, I can't take anymore. It's just, they're so beautiful, and they're just, they overwhelm my senses, because I just want to look more and more and more, and I can't. I have to stop somewhere.
And we use a Past Perfect museum software to manage our collections, and I guess we could just do a search for the word for quilt under object name. I don't even think we thought to do that necessarily. That's probably how we found where they were, but I don't know if we actually did a count. I looked at the pictures that I sent you. I at least sent you a picture of close to 20 different
Did you? Oh,
ones. Yeah.
No wonder my brain was.
So I was really amazed about the White Rose Club. What you said about that, I really would like to do some more research.
Yeah.
Now that Springfield papers are on newspapers.com, it's made research a lot easier for things. And I'm wondering, if I did a search for White Rose Club, if I might be able to find some more about that actual club now. So I put that on my to-do list.
So far, I haven't found a lot. What interests me, and this is very speculative, is that she's listed on the back of the quilt as Reverend Henrietta G. Moore. Now, in Protestant churches, there were not that many women preachers at that time. But there are a lot of African American reverend females. I can't help wondering if she is, if not the whole White Rose Club, is a chapter for the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Springfield. That's an avenue that we would have to really explore. And we don't have any other quilts in the collection that are attached to the African American population here in Springfield and Clark County.
That's a lot of names on the quilt too. So we should look up some of those names too.
Yes, yes.
There's a question if there's any quilts from the Civil War era in our collection.
Yes, we have some that date from not specifically 1860, but a little bit earlier and a little bit later. We have a couple 1850s, 40s and 50s, not anything from the 60s. I think it's because we either gave them all away or they were so used during the Civil War that they just didn't survive. And then we have a couple from 1870 and especially 1870 on. We have what, at least 6 or 8 crazy quilts. They were just so popular that I know I looked and looked and looked, but we had a bunch and too many to show tonight. We could do just a whole talk about crazy quilts.
Yeah, and they're so beautiful. They're the one that you didn't share. So I think I'm going to try and put together an album.
Okay.
But one that you didn't share was the GAR one.
Oh
that
yeah.
had all of the GAR ribbons on it. And I had never seen that one until you had those out. So that was really wonderful.
Yeah, it's a most interesting one. And I debated, I really struggled with not showing it. But it just didn't quite fit. We were getting kind of overloaded with crazy quilts, but it's actually almost a military quilt because the ribbons, the silk, are ribbons from 110th regimental reunions. And they go from about 1868 to about later, about 1880 to 1890. And I'm not sure I remember that correctly, but they're reunion badges. And so some of them are, they're from all over, every place that the 110th went. There's actually some ribbons that show the different regiments. I know one is 110th. I'm not sure what the other two are. But they went all over Ohio, and doing reunions like that was very normal and expected. What's interesting as well is there are a couple Republican primary tickets that were printed on silk that are included on that quilt. So it has a very interesting history, and one that we honestly do not know enough about. The research it makes me kind of want to dive back in again, because there's a whole lot that we still don't know. And I guess just because I love research and I love objects. Nirvana.
There's a good question in the chat from Belle about she has a 1920s or 30s quilt made by her grandfather's sisters in Mansfield, asking if she should donate it somewhere in Ohio or pass it on to my kids. So I'll answer what first we always say, see if anyone in the family would like
Yes,
it first.
always.
Always offer to family first. And then Mansfield's in Richland County, so you might check with their historical society. And this is a good spot for me to put in the chat a link for how to contact us. If you are interested in donating anything to us, we ask first that you contact us first. Please do not bring anything in and try and drop it off and run away. We would like to talk to you, find out what you have, talk about if we would like it. And we've showed that we do have a lot of quilts, but we would still like to talk to you about your quilts. Our collecting parameters are for Springfield and Clark County history. So, your quilt from Richland County should go to either your family or to Richland County, not to here. But that's a good question, Virginia. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but
well, and if you're looking for reputable suppliers of acid-free material, the Historical Society are the proper people to call. There's a lot of things out there commercially that say acid-free, but it doesn't tell you if it really is acid-free. Yes, it costs a lot, but your own personal treasures and your own personal history are worth it. I think.
And I think one tip that we could give as far as storage, if you are storing a quilt in your own home, is to try and offer it some padding
Yes.
in the corners. If you do have to have it folded, try and pad up those edges as much as possible so that you're not having a stiff fold, because that could cause breakage of the fabric. There was a question about displaying these, if it might be viable to have them done to scale and displayed, which I don't know if we've ever thought of anything like that.
Oh, I have. Yeah, if first of all, it would cost a little money, because if we're going to do it, we're going to do it flat, so you can see the whole quilt. And in my opinion, it should be done with a plexiglass cover so that people can see it, but they're not handling it, because they are really delicate. As you can see by a couple of them, there was some fractured silk, and that can catch on accidentally on a ring, on a hangnail, on anything else. Any kind of quilt display, we could probably get 6 or 8 in the hallway at the Heritage Center. But I've always wanted to do that.
I visited several museums this last weekend that had quilts on display, but they were folded in cases, so you could just see bits and pieces of them. And I assumed that they switched them out seasonally, so you were just and some of them were on beds in historic homes I was at. So that's another way, but you wouldn't want to leave them out for it long term or without protection.
Yeah, and 3 months, 6 maybe is about all they could stand being out in the light.
Does anybody have any other questions for Virginia?
Sorry, I have this cold that just makes me look like I've been on as my grandmother would say, I've been on a toot.
Well, I'll add one more link in here for the sake of my boss, Roger. If you want to donate monetarily, there's also a link for that. That it helps support programs like this and care of our collections and care of, upkeep, things like that. So, I'll add that link in there as well. But
I was gonna say, I saw a hand. Kathy has another question.
oh, yes. Good.
Unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
There you go. Go ahead.
You mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of things weren't documented, and we always hear that controversy, particularly during Black History Month, about enslaved people making their quilts and the stories that they made for the Underground Railroad. And now, if you look like the Smithsonian and everybody, they're kind of adding an additional story, saying that perhaps it wasn't true, but there is also the story that they're not documented. So they didn't read and write. They were not allowed to read and write. So I think there's a lot to the oral tradition of the Underground Railroad and it having true meaning. What do you have to add for that?
Well, that's a really good question. When the book Hidden in Plain Sight came out, I read it voraciously, and so did everyone else. And they made some convincing arguments that quilts were used as indicators of, which way is north from here, who can help you, how do you get to the next stop on the Underground Railroad. Unfortunately, almost right away, maybe a year, 2 years later, there was a lot of debunking that people went, yeah, I don't know, how much did they quilt? We know that a lot of the really fancy quilts that were made in the South were actually made both by the ladies of the house, the mistress of the house, and by very, very skilled slaves. So some of the really fancy ones that might be now in museums could have been made by both the mistress and the slave. How much did slaves have access to fabric? Again, that's a question that is very difficult to answer. Would they have kept? Would their owners let them keep pieces of clothing once they had been worn and worn out. I don't think there's enough information on that. I know that there was and I missed it. I was sorry I did. There was a beautiful quilt exhibit at the National Afro-American Museum in Wilberforce. And has, from what I have heard, a lovely exhibit catalog that went with their exhibit. I would like to know a whole lot more, and I would hope that this type of presentation might spark someone to say, oh, we know more about the White Rose Club, or we know more about those questions, because I don't think there's enough that we know yet. We just don't know. And it's a real question, and one that deserves continued research.
Patty?
Virginia, it's always an amazing presentation. Loved listening to you talk on any topic, but the difference between knotting and quilting, was it because people didn't have time to do the whole quilting aspect, or what prompted people to knot quilts?
Oh, really good question. I don't know where to start. Even now, people do a lot of knotting. In fact, I'm part of the quilting group at my church. And we, every other Monday, we lay out quilts on 3 great big tables and lay out the 3 layers, the bottom, the middle, and the top. And we actually knot. These are quilts that are being given to Lutheran World Relief for distribution in the US. So people who have gone through tornadoes and fires and floods will receive these quilts. Frankly, we knot because it's fast. and we can, if we're on a roll in a 2-hour period, we can do 5, which is pretty decent if we have enough women there, at least 5 or 6 of us. Some of it was, especially with the crazy quilt, is that the stitching really would detract from the beauty of the way it was put together. And that was true for both the log cabin and the crazy quilt, since they used the same construction method. The one quilt in the Historical Society collections that actually is a crazy quilt and is quilted, you can see the knottings on the back. So the knots are hidden on the back, but on the front, you can see these kind of little white things. Well, it's the thread, but they just kind of appear in strange places. And I couldn't figure it out until I started really investigating the quilts. It kind of does detract. I can understand why they didn't do any stitching or even necessarily any tying, because you want that visual impact that both kinds of quilts had, and they were definitely high impact. As my grandmother would say, these quilts are for show, not for blow. They don't go in your bedroom, they go in your parlor. They go in your living room. You want people to see them. It says we are moneyed. If you can buy velvets and quilts and brocades, honey, you got money.
Well, that's a good lead into one of the questions in the chat about the everyday use of these. The comment was about how ours look to be in such good condition. Were they really used?
Oh yeah. There's one, and I must admit, you missed some of them because I knew I was all of a sudden running out of time. I got carried away. Oh, but there's one quilt that is a Lemoyne star. It's very well constructed. The design is really, really strong, but you can tell even in the slide that there's just a lot of loss. The quilts were used, they were reused, And this one has part of the batting sticking out, not everywhere, but there's definitely damage on one side. And especially the crazy quilts, because they had a lot of silk in them. The silk unfortunately fractures, it deteriorates so easily, especially depending upon where the quilts were stored before we got them, that the silk is in well, in shreds, in just in strings in some places. The last quilt, the Raider quilt, that is by far the best one that we have, because it's not only whole, but each piece of the fabric, each little fabric piece is in marvelous condition. I should look so good.
There's a comment in the chat about the In Plain Sight book that you mentioned about the Underground Railroad quilt stories, saying that after it came out, there was African American history scholars said that there really wasn't evidence to support that artifact wise, or that a lot of the patterns that were discussed weren't used until after 1900. And there's, if you want to read more about it, there's articles about it in the American Quilt Study Group that they said. So I know that that was something that we used in programming here.
Yeah.
After that book came out, and we still have like coloring pages and resources that were put out there. So we've we'd pulled back on using that after it was,
yeah.
But I know it makes for a good romantic story, but not necessarily a lot of information to back it up.
Yeah, and I respect that Black African American historians themselves are saying, no, there's not enough evidence. There's not enough physical evidence to support what the book is saying. And I kind of wondered when I was reading it, and then I could, after we had done our programming, I thought, I don't know anymore. Yeah.
So, and there's always new information coming out about things, and yeah, so
there always is.
So are there any other questions? Well, I want to thank you again, Virginia, for joining us and sharing your expertise. And I'm glad that we got you back in to get your hands on everything, and that we finally got to do this with you. So, and I want to thank everybody for coming, and let you know about our next upcoming program, which is actually going to be in a couple of weeks. We're going to do another virtual program that focuses on Jonathan Winters, who was a Springfielder, and we had recently run across some interviews that were just done with him, kind of off the cuff, one that he was doing promotional stuff for the Heritage Center back in the late 90s. So we're going to share some of those videos and some other clips and let people reminisce, because the 10-year anniversary of his death is coming up in April. And so that upcoming program will be on Wednesday, April 12th at 7 o'clock. So we'll encourage people to come and learn more about him, and laugh and share stories. And so that'll be the next one. And then after that, they're still on here. Our May program is with special guest Bob and Flossie Holsizer. We're going to do a kind of a genealogy 101 to let people know what kind of resources and stories that they can uncover here in Springfield and Clark County. So that'll be our May 10th virtual program. So if anybody has any other ideas of things that they'd like to see in the future, you can contact us through Facebook, or archives@heritagecenter.us comes to me. If you've got any ideas of other topics that you'd like to see. But Virginia, we'll probably get you back out here for clothes or something else that you really love from the collection. So we'll be happy to have you again. So,
Thank you, everyone.
So thank you everybody for coming. Have a good night.